Hi, Mike. Welcome on board. Great to see you today.
Thanks, Bikash. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So we have a very interesting topic around what are the top attack vectors and the emerging threats which we are facing today. And cybersecurity is one of those adventure games which never gets less exciting, right? So let's jump in. And before we do that, it'll be great if you could have a quick intro, a baseball card kind of intro about a baseball card, take it from there.
I'm happy to, certainly. Mike Spanbauer, I work for Juniper Networks, and my role here is customer architect, technology evangelist, and really, I help help guide organizations regarding technical issues and related to the threat landscape and what we're all seeing around the world from both current campaigns and effective techniques that are in place. A little background: I love to woodwork, read, and of course also spend time in the kitchen when I'm not writing or investigating, and coffee and baking, the whole scheme of food and so forth, delights that are the culinary world. But I admit I've burnt probably more than I've made in terms of delicacies. But I try.
That's interesting. I love cooking too. So what kind of cooking do you love?
Breads, I think, are probably, yeah.
That's one of the harder ones.
It is. But if you get it right, it's magical.
Absolutely. So I am more of an intuitive cook. I don't actually follow the recipes. So I would like to go and kind of do it like jazz, improvise. But bread is one thing where you can't improvise. I mean, you have to go very measured, and you have to follow exactly the structure, measure things well. Is that right?
It is. It is. If you add too much, flour or the yeast is too aged, I mean, you end up with a result that you weren't expecting. And in some cases, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but more often than not, it's not good.
Yeah, so you need a lot of experimentation and then find out that formula that works and then stick to that. So that's a hard thing. It's I think it's much maybe a bit like security, huh? Quite hard. Getting the bread right is quite hard.
It is. It
Great,
is.
Mike. So let's jump into our topic today. So you had been in the industry for very long. You have seen how things have changed, and especially in the today's context with a lot of this remote working and the rapid movement of businesses getting into the digital transformation, etc., etc. So things have scaled up and also transformed in various different ways. So what are some of the top threats? So we'll keep it slightly broad. We'll mix threats and attack vectors. So let it be flexible. So um, what are some of those top threats and attacks which you consider a CISO or the security professional should be keeping at the top of their mind?
Ah, it's such a broad space, right? There's a lot that they need to balance and juggle, but really the keys to start it off is you need to know what's connected, right? You need to know what your attack surface is, and there's no substitute for an effective inventory. Not to mention, right? As this pandemic has complicated our working lives and the technology required to support it, and the architectures that organizations have adopted in turn have also grown more complex in most scenarios. But by being more complex, of course, you've now further expanded the attack surface, and that complicates the role of the cyber investigator or the incident responder to ensure that they can see the indicators of attack, of compromise, and so forth across the whole of that. And I think to that point, right? You've got remote workers with home networks, not always using VPN, potentially exposing their machines, and that forces more hygiene needs for patching. In fact, I would argue that the prior patch schedule to the to the pandemic, right, to the lockdown, was perhaps insufficient. And if you've not adjusted that frequency, the cadence of patching, I would argue you ought to take a close look and see what that's set to, because the number of browser attacks, the prospect of just initial compromise, but also the in the middle mechanics, right? Browser in the middle, man in the middle in advanced, have also grown considerably more prevalent. So really. There's many different facets to this, but that's just one particular sort of area of the domain. Right now, I'd be remiss not to mention that while ransomware is of course a bit old, and we've all heard about it for now the better part of 2.5-3 years. It is still the number one infection concern, and frankly business impact continuity issue for many. It costs more now on average for a ransom than it does for a breach, and so that is reason alone to spend time on it here and make sure that those elements are top of mind, right? So techniques in use, right, include credentials, credential theft, or stuffing, or brute force mechanics to get through weak passwords. Is the entropy set effectively or complex enough? And so all they need is one with that toehold, right? That footprint in an organization. Then, well, if they move silently and carefully, then the potential to lock up not just the existing machines, but also potentially infect backups becomes very real.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of very interesting points. So let's dive a little bit deeper, Mike. You mentioned about attack surface, and you also mentioned about ransomware, right? So let's look into the attack surface a little bit, and I think this is a very interesting challenge, which was there always. I mean, looking at the attack surface had always been a kind of one of the top priorities for a threat modeler or somebody doing the architecture review, and somebody who used to go very deep into it. But the interesting thing that has happened is that the attack surface has become so large today that the attack surface management has become a mainstream thing, which was earlier not there. And
right.
The few of the key reasons why, as you mentioned, why this has happened is because of this remote working and cloud adoption and agile workforce, decentralized teams, etc., etc. Now, if we go a little bit deeper into the attack surface, and I remember one of the security researchers I was talking to in terms of what were the top strategies, and he works for one of these top 10 technology companies globally. We were discussing about what are some of the top priorities which you would have, and I think we discussed about 6 or 7, and out of that, and this is like a few years back, 4 or 5 years back. So one of the things he mentioned was reduction of attack surface.
Right.
So and that reduction today has become exponential kind of increase, right? I mean, we could not reduce, rather we have increased significantly. Yes, Mike, you were talking about.
No, you're absolutely right. It's gone the other direction, right? I know we've always espoused and preached that it's always best to reduce the attack surface, but the fact of the matter is that most organizations have suffered an enormous explosion of potential vulnerable points, right, or potential gaps that an attacker can get a foothold. So it's
so the interesting thing, Mike, is 5 years back, the researchers we used to speak about attack surface reduction. Today, as an industry, we are talking about attack surface management.
Right.
Because we have understood reduction is not possible. We need to manage this because this is going to otherwise go out of control. And this is a great point which you mentioned. So I just wanted to emphasize on that. You also mentioned about ransomware as the second point. Obviously, this is one of the top risks. Everybody is aware of this. So you had been working with multiple organizations in the past, and you have seen many of these attacks happening before. What are some of the top um, attack vectors which you are seeing the ransomware guys are using today?
I think in terms of vectors or means of sort of penetration and effective infection, right? The most prominent remains email. So phishing or even spear phishing in the case of a very targeted attack is often the first point of initial infection, right? They allow themselves to get a remote kit or some mechanism on the local client of whomever, right, who clicks on it, and then from there you install recon bot or some other method to kind of survey the rest of the organization and potentially find additional weak points. Perhaps jumping off to a printer that's not had its firmware updated, though have enough CPU and processing power to run a fair Linux stack. And so that's in many cases what is under the hood. And so the result of those mini distributions are that you can get a foothold from an older exploit that they just never patched. They didn't know, right? Some orgs aren't aware of those vulnerabilities because they're dependent on the printer management. And does it print? Does it not print? Not is it an application stack that is itself vulnerable and has 4, 5, 6 CVEs on it? That's still the case. And so the initial point though remains predominantly mail. Phishing, spear phishing, and a user that misclicks on some attractive link, something with some social appeal that really manages to compel for that initial permission, right? That initial click.
Yeah, and Mike, I'll share an interesting story. This is like 2 decades back. This was during my engineering school days. So I was more of a science guy, computer science guy. I wasn't into hacking. Eventually, like my first venture was on automating penetration testing, etc. I got into that field, but my core area was more of algorithms and science. So I remember that in our school days, there were all these group of hackers, and not too many, but there were a few of those. And what these guys used to do was they used to wait for a new vulnerability to come up. And the moment a new CV comes up, the goal was like how quickly they could write an exploit, and then do a mass sweep of like scanning across the network of the school, and then compromise any of the assets which they could find. So that used to happen at the university level in the university network. Now the interesting thing that has happened is exactly this thing today is happening at the internet level. So what around 2 decades back the hackers used to do in a small university network, they're now doing it at a large 3 billion IP address space. So what hackers today are doing is that the moment a new CV is there, or suppose some patches get released, and they would go and try to reverse and find out the vulnerability, write an exploit, etc. So that's more sophisticated, the second one which I mentioned. But for even the easier ones, the moment a new opportunity comes, the ransomware guys are creating a very kind of pointed pointed, like you call it a script or whatever, which goes and kind of scans every single IP address one after another, finds out whether that port is active, and then try out that exploit on that. So it's a mass sweeping of that same exploit across the internet. So each of these ransomware actors know that for them, the window of opportunity is those initial few months, because there are many actors who are trying this. And these days, what is happening is that if there is an open database, a ransomware guy would go and kind of encrypted, then the second guy cannot come. So there is a race amongst the ransomware guys. So the interesting thing which I just recalled as you were mentioning was that story during my school days or the university days. That same thing is actually happening at an internet scale today. So one vector, as you mentioned, is the phishing based or email based delivery and compromise of assets, and then lateral movement, etc. The other is external recon and attack based model. So these are the two primary kind of ransomware vectors in a broad class scenario, if we think. And of course, when you go dig deeper, the number of vectors would be several.
Right, right, and I think you touched on something that is worth also further speaking to, and that's the prospect of the internet, right? Cloud, and things that aren't on your premises, right? Without having direct access to it. Your files are now located often in a service, in multiple services in most cases, and mindfully managing, what data is where. I mean, DLP was difficult when it was on premises, right? In the past, data loss prevention, categorization, and so forth. But we at least knew where the data flows were and where that data was, ingressing and egressing. Now, in the context of cloud, right, you've got a considerably more complex data structure, and therefore, again, a larger attack surface and potential points of compromise. So as apps become more distributed, your tools need to adapt and to evolve to support that. So indeed, it's a fascinating, but of course, challenging world in which we find ourselves regarding security and protection of all the, the most critical business assets.
Yeah, great. So we spoke about attack surface, we spoke about ransomware, and we also spoke about phishing-based attacks. What's next? And which are the other things which you would consider as one of those top
There's
kind of
there's many.
vectors
I mean,
or threats?
the one that I anticipate we'll see more often, moving forward and demands additional diligence is what we saw with the SolarWinds attack, right? So supply chain compromise and the potential to insert, code or something malicious, some mechanic that allows an actor the freedom, authority, or ability to do something after. But by being in the middle, becoming in essence a trusted envelope of code somewhere along that path, they gain permissions that they would not otherwise have. I think that this will continue to grow in popularity. Now, admittedly, right, this is not a simple broad market technique that'll be used by all, right? This is a more advanced type of attack, but there were other examples where there were repos of code also compromised, and if they were to have been published, via standard Git scripts and so forth, as folks have automatic code updates, right? Those would have been pulled over to the organization, the business, that uses that particular, library. It would have been deployed as production machine code, and in turn automatically, or would have, in turn compromised any of the orgs that used that specific code sequence. Now, the two incidents that occurred most recently in the last few months were both, caught before they actually went live. But to see, again, an increase in frequency and the potential exposure demands that organizations pay close attention to how they're using code and what code is employed, because you can't just trust by, cert alone now, right? That's the point. It's also additional diligence, pen testing. There's no substitute for knowing your code before it goes to production, and I think that these attack types will continue to grow, and the risk, of course, is enormous, right? Had that been effective, it would have compromised, hundreds, if not thousands, of potential organizations, as the Exchange vulns that were disclosed did, and as the SolarWinds attack did before.
Yeah, and in fact, the supply chain risk or third party and in fact even fourth party risk, this becomes very interesting. And I remember a very interesting story. So once we discovered that there was an open database containing data of, I mean, 3 or 4 banks. And once that was reported to this one of these banking organizations, this is the interesting part. They mentioned, you know what, that looks like our data, but the name is there in the asset, etc. It looks like our data, but that's not our IP address. And eventually, we figured out that the IP address belongs to a specific startup. And these guys went back and looked into their third-party vendor list and came back and said, you know what, this startup is not in our vendor list. And then they did further analysis, and eventually what they figured out was that this organization did a proof of concept with this particular startup, and one of the business units did that with them. They gave real data to this startup, and eventually they did not work together, so it never went through the third party vendor risk management program. It was not even part of their TPRM program or in the third party list, and a huge amount of data of the bank was exposed through this organization. Now this is a very interesting thing. It's more like a shadow, like we talk about shadow IT assets, right? And this is more like a shadow vendor, a vendor of yours, but you are not aware of that vendor. So it's a part of that supply chain, but then kind of shadow supply chain. So this is a very interesting thing which I noticed some time back, and I guess this kind of things are going to become more common. So supply chain risks and third-party risks are being talked about for a very long time, right? But then in the long run, this is going to change and this is going to morph, and the way this is going to happen is going to become a lot more complex than what we have seen in the past. And then the nation state actors would put a lot of energy into finding out 0 days in some of those interesting applications which are used widely, etc. So I absolutely agree with you. Supply chain is going to be one of those very interesting areas to look out for. So, Mike, what else? What are the other things which you would
I
like to
think
highlight?
I think what we've witnessed over the last probably 12 to 24 months is increasingly sophisticated and capable reconnaissance techniques, right? Knowing what to weaponize, where there is a point of vulnerability, and what will ultimately go as undetected as possible for as long as possible is all part of the game. Knowing who to potentially reach out to, right? The prospect of social engineering, just doing your homework. Actors do this and have gotten much better at it than they ever have been, using much more than simple, web queries and past breach materials to help augment, password matrices and so forth. Moving on to, handshake mirrors and being able to inspect the transactions as secure connections are established in order to gain or glean kind of key insights to an organization's infrastructure, where the key servers are, and so forth, potentially exposing much greater risk. And so the reconnaissance methods are much more subtle, but as effective or more so than they ever have been. And we're seeing more multi-stage kind of techniques, attacks that have several pieces to them that ultimately give them a far greater chance of evading detection and block than we've ever seen. And that sophistication ought to give concern to many to ensure that they've got visibility to all of the activities, some sort of a behavioral awareness and profiling mechanic, and ultimately that they know exactly who's on the network, what's on the network, back to that asset and user identity piece I mentioned before, as well as when they're supposed to be on the behavior side and what they're supposed to be doing, so that accounting doesn't have access to engineering, or engineering's not trying to pull sales records, right? These are not normal behaviors, and if something like that does occur, then you either have an insider or you have potential actor working from a node within your environment. So that's what that reconnaissance offers them, and what we need to be mindful of as an industry to constantly be diligent and stay on top of it.
Yeah, you mentioned something very interesting, and I remember one of those childhood days, one of those poems, which was I don't remember exactly, but it was like, for want of a nail, the horseshoe was lost. So for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, and for want of a shoe, the horse was lost, and because the horse was lost, the general was lost, and because for want of a general, the battle was lost. So basically, at the end of a day, because of a small nail, which was not there in the horseshoe, the battle was lost. So that kind of things are actually becoming very common today in the security scenario because of a small misconfiguration in an
Yeah.
asset which was not known or was not part of the asset inventory. And then some nation state actor who does continuous reconnaissance on their adversary countries, and there are many of the nation state actors having that kind of capability, right? They find out that one small asset out there which was not under the kind of radar of everybody, small configuration issue, use that to break into, and then from there do lateral movement and finally break into. So it's that kind of multi-stage attack which you mentioned, right? And that kind of stuff is becoming more and more common rather than those 0 days kind of stuff. So yes, I mean, a nuclear weapon like that of Hiroshima, I mean, which is equivalent to probably these 0 days. So yes, that kind of war can happen, but what's happening most often is this for want of a nail story. Because of a nail, the battle is lost. So most of the breaches are very simple.
Mhm.
Very
But
few
effective.
breaches engages that kind of 0 days and stuff like that, right?
Exactly.
And reconnaissance plays a very big role, whether it's the ransomware guys or it is the nation state actors. Everybody uses two things as primary kind of their toolkit. One is reconnaissance as one of the first step, and the other is social engineering. I think these are the two biggest weapons in the hands of our adversary.
Yeah,
Mike, did
and
you think the same? Do you agree with
absolutely.
that?
And I think I do, and I think that's where they've been investing the most over the last several years. They recognize that that's where they increase their outcome, their odds of success. And at the end of the day, most actors, they run it as a business. It is a business for the bulk of them, and so the more effective their attack techniques, the faster that they can extort or extract, say, a ransomware payment in that scenario, the more readily monetized the exercise, the energy, and the more profitable, literally, they are for the time. They've robust processes in place, and I think certainly the whole concept of a script kiddie or these immature hackers and less sophisticated processes, that's long past. The bulk are now fairly able business folks that deal in these activities, and as a result, they have service levels, they have strict schedules, they have very hardened approaches to effectively compromising organizations. And so I think very much the case. And you touched on one point that I neglected to expand on, but it's very critical, and that's the whole prospect of exposed policies, misconfigured policies. Of course, I think many have heard of the plague of S3 buckets being incorrectly configured. The fact is that we're all taxed. Folks are incredibly busy, and being diligent, ensuring that the right permissions are set, the right things are locked, and that the right keys and access mechanics are in place, are all part of ensuring that you don't have a much more egregious issue to resolve, right? The job of setting up the app is difficult in some cases, but the job of cleaning up the mess after something happens with compromise is much more significant.
Yeah, and in fact, there's another thing I just kind of vaguely remember. in the context of reconnaissance, that many of the bug bounty players today are doing reconnaissance and passing on that reconnaissance information to the researchers on the bug bounty platform and providing them that intelligence that here is an asset that is potentially vulnerable and you can deep dive, because if the researchers make more money, then the bug bounty companies also make more money, right? So reconnaissance as a kind of strategy is not just being used by ransomware guys, it's not just being used by the nation state actors, but it's also being used by even the bug bounty players, which is a very interesting thing. So reconnaissance has become a pretty big thing today, which wasn't probably 5 years back. I remember probably first 6 years back was the first time there was Recon Village in DEF CON. So it's not a kind of, even though the art of reconnaissance was known for a pretty long time, it became mainstream just about recently.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the other areas, Mike, which you would like to highlight?
I think the one that we need to spend a moment on is really the whole adoption of and investment in developing their own artificial intelligence and machine learning models. Right? So actors have been using iterative heuristics and others, simpler script mechanics now for a number of years. Right? That's been the case for 5, 10 years. Right? And so they've gotten more efficient. The models have grown bigger, and of course, as you know, machine learning is dependent on the data it gets, and so they've had now the benefit of time and great backups, and they usually don't lose much. The ability to kind of capture and iterate on all these data flows that they've been observing, as well as all the compromised credentials, right, of years past, right? Yahoo, Facebook, right? Aggregating all of the different, personal credentials, right? As humans, we tend to keep the same kind of password patterns, and so unless you have a machine generating your passwords for you and using a password vault, then the password techniques we use and the mnemonics and so forth, the strings, are largely similar, enough so that the machine learning models and AI allow them to crack your credentials with a great deal less effort and energy than it would have taken 4 or 5 years ago, because as I mentioned a second ago, their backups haven't failed. They've not lost all those breach details. And the fact is, you don't get to change who your first cat was, who your first dog was, right? Your kid's name, your addresses, all these details that help kind of identify who you are, that you also know are part of entropy and mechanics asked for secret questions and such. So pause a second and recognize that this is the state, and that the only solution is also not just great password entropy, but also multi-factor auth, and actors will continue to abuse and frankly improve on their ability to identify and use credentials as we progress, due to AI, due to more robust machine learning models over the next several years. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So AI and ML is being used by the adversary to break in, but also another interesting trend which I am seeing is that adversary is also using AI and ML to poison the learning of the AI and ML on the other side.
Right.
So that it becomes less effective.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of interesting game which is getting started on the AI ML, both on the defense as well as on the offense side.
Yeah, no, that's that data quality, right? The data that goes in drives the value of the ML model, the ML output, and so your poisoning comment is absolutely the case. We've seen it in a few campaigns over the last 12, 15 months, and yeah, it's very much a technique in use.
Wonderful. So we spoke about quite a few interesting stuff until now, Mike, and are there some other areas in terms of threats or attack vectors or techniques which you would like to talk about?
We could go on for quite some time. I mean, really, I think what I'll offer is this, right? I think that, the actors are very diligent and that they're constantly working to find ways to compromise more quickly, to be able to monetize most effectively, and to ultimately achieve their objectives. Right. Our role, as protectors, as Blue, as the defense side, is to continually work on increasing our awareness of our potential points of entrance, right? UIs, web apps and forms, right? The APIs in use, right? Open source libraries and where those are located, in which apps, in which stacks, when were they updated, making sure you have some automated tools in place to track for this. And there's never a substitute for continuous tests, for, active assessment of your defenses, right? Your blue team must constantly be, kind of exercised with either red exercises, or you can you can combine into the purple work that's becoming increasingly popular in cyber range techniques. But the web apps, the stacks, the storage locations, the data sites, all of these comprise that complex attack surface. And so actors know that this is, all an aggregate opportunity, and that again in turn demands that each organization carefully assess what's exposed where, that they have the right controls and techniques to manage and to effectively, support their organization's business needs, but also their risk tolerance. And this is the challenge. This is why I do what I do. This is why I suspect many listening do what they do, and it's that passion, that drive for us to continually innovate and to help organizations, become increasingly aware. That gets me out of bed in the morning. Right. This is the stuff that I absolutely get jazzed about and love doing.
Wonderful, Mike. So you brought out some very interesting points. I'll just quickly highlight those. You spoke about API security. You also spoke about red teaming and purple teaming. You also spoke about continuous security validation. You did not use the word continuous security validation, but I think something similar, continuous security testing or something like that. And I just wanted to highlight on this continuous security validation thing. I think this is a very important part, more on the defense side, right? Even though our topic today is more on from the side of the threats and attack vectors. But if we think of the defense, we need to move from those once in a year or quarterly or daily to continuous, and that continuous security validation is becoming more and more important. And then risk-based vulnerability management, I consider that also something very important. And continuous security validation is coming up in many different forms. Like when you do it internally, you have this breach and attack simulation technologies. When you do it externally, there is continuous attack surface management, or continuous automated red teaming, or continuous penetration testing, etc., etc. So this is a very interesting area where I personally find very interesting, and I find myself very interested in, and I'm kind of watching out this space quite keenly.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to highlight another point, that's on the frauds. And what we are noticing, and I'm sure you too, is a lot of these frauds. Like one of the challenges which the fraudsters are facing is, like with the world kind of because of COVID, and also even before COVID, everything is going online, right? So even the fraudsters have gone online in a very significant manner. So a lot of those old school fraudster guys have now kind of gone digital. Just like we have this digital movement, the fraud guys also have moved digital. They have their own kind of call centers, they have their own IT infrastructure, and running frauds at a scale is another major threat which I am observing. And you earlier mentioned about man in the browser attack, etc., for frauds, where this OTP, etc., is not enough, because now they have those mechanisms to collect OTP by means of either being in the browser or calling that guy up and taking the OTP, or sending a message and getting the OTP. They are doing all kinds of social engineering. That even with two-factor authentications, users are now losing money from their wallets, from their bank accounts, etc. Another area of fraud, which or a few other areas of fraud which I'm seeing quite often, are things like the wallet frauds, in case of e-commerce, etc. People doing credential stuffing and stealing money from the wallets. Another kind of fraud which I'm seeing very often is these invoice fraud, where you know the classic kind of scenario, right? The invoice is sent, somebody did not pay, there's this follow-up that this invoice is yet to be paid, and then these guys say, like, you know what, instead of this account, please send the money to the other account, or in between during the communication, change the account details and the money goes to some other place. So we are
Right.
seeing a lot of these kind of variations of frauds, which is also happening at scale, not just targeted towards enterprises, but also targeted towards individuals.
Right. Right. Agreed. I think, this all highlights, the need for, improved awareness, right? The users need to be mindful of where they're using, various tools, right? What resources they're accessing. And, I mean, in the case of some of the more advanced techniques where it's very, very difficult to discern, or frankly, it's completely, you know, it requires no user involvement. The actor oftentimes can get past or get by with that without the user ever being aware. But you touched on one earlier that is indeed probably the more traditional and still very effective form of fraud mechanics, which is that in the middle mechanic of a very artfully doctored site that looks exactly like your institutions, and by credentials loss in moments, right? They'll effectively be able to transact and withdraw, or potentially launder funds, in moments, right? Because these systems work faster than we can even click a log out, and so these are all very much prevalent and continue to plague the space.
So a lot of things to keep us awake, Mike, right? You don't need the coffee
No,
to keep us
yeah.
awake.
I think this is back to that fascination with the space, right? Never a dull moment, and I think this is where I find great pleasure in working with folks like yourself, like others throughout the industry, kind of sharing what we've learned and how we've seen various protections, various approaches defeat the techniques, what's working, what's not. This is how we continue to improve our practices, right? I hesitate to call them best practices because tomorrow they won't be, and that's the point, right? We constantly iterate, we constantly need to improve, because I promise the actors are not sitting still. They're not just remaining idle. They're iterating. The recon techniques and other mechanics that we've discussed here are examples of that, and they'll continue to do so.
Yeah, and this is a very humbling field in a way, and I'll tell you one interesting story. This is like 1.5 decade back, early days of my career. We started a company. We were into hacking and stuff like that, did a lot of zero-day research. So in a way, I mean, being with hackers makes you paranoid, right? So I had a bit of this paranoia, quite obviously. And another interesting thing about myself is that I used to do a lot of these magic shows, more like David Blaine kind of show, more of mentalism and mental kind of stuff, not so much of illusion, but more of mental kind of stuff. So I was deep into magic, and I used to do kind of semi-professional shows. So I was doing it at a decent level, and that this backstory is important for the next part of the story. So I went to Paris, and I remember I was going down. It was a slightly cloudy day, a little bit drizzle outside. So I was going down the stairs into the metro, um, the underground metro. And while I was going down, there's a guy who came and mentioned that I need to sell this iPhone. And iPhone just came up during that time. Just iPhone got released. And I was more of a BlackBerry guy. So I was not using iPhone during those days. So this guy said, would you like to buy this? I said, no, I don't want to buy it. And then this guy mentioned that I badly need this money and I would give you at a very good price. I still said, no, not interested. This guy kept on following me up, and he mentioned that, you know what, I have my sister who is ill and I need this money very badly. It'll be of great help, etc. And he started off with a few €100 and eventually came down to something like a €10 or €20. I don't remember exactly. So he gave me a great deal. He said, you know what, my sister is ill and I need this money very badly. And here is the iPhone. And here I'm also going to give you a automatic Kodak camera, those plastic ones, both together for just €20. And I, truly speaking, felt felt a bit greedy. I mean, it wasn't really because I wanted to help that guy, to be honest. So I became greedy and I said, okay, I'm going to take it. I was thinking, in worst case, even if the phone is fake, I could see that the screen was working, etc. We could take it back, open it up, reverse engineer, and play with it, etc. So I gave him €20, and this guy took out a small brown bag, put the phone and the camera inside, and gave it to me. And once he gave it to me, he started running up the stairs. And then I opened this brown bag, and inside there were 2 potatoes. So he did the
Clever.
classic switch in front of me. And I used to do exactly. I was pretty trained in those palming techniques, which he did right in front of me.
Yeah,
I had
clever.
being part of hacking and all these things. I had been pretty paranoid in certain ways, right? Being a security professional, but right in front of me, he showed me the magic, fooled me, and went away. And that was one of the most humbling days. I realized that it doesn't matter. I mean, there will be those moments when bad things can happen. So.
Yeah. No, and I think that story is particularly relevant in respect to security, not because so much that you fell for, sleight of hand, but because, a lot of folks that are in this industry are indeed, quite expert. But there's always that moment that, the sun, reflection, some distraction, right? There was some technique that he used, and that's, not unlike some of the approaches used by actors today. And so that's, I think, incredibly, poignant to share with the audience. And indeed, it can happen to any of us, regardless of how capable we are. And humbling certainly, but I mean, it's that lesson, right? That opportunity to learn from that motion, that we all need to be mindful, because in cyber, you need to always be learning, because there's no way to ever master it all.
So the attackers need to just succeed once. We as a defender have to succeed every time, right? So that makes the game very hard. So thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot for sharing these techniques. We are extremely grateful to have you as a part of the community and for coming down and sharing your insights. Thank you so
No,
much, Mike.
thank you for having me. It's been wonderful. Appreciate it.